Sure, I have changed, and the Republican Party has changed, but I argue that the media business has changed much more. When I got started 30 years ago at WWDB, personality mattered, not ideology. The headliners were all local and quite a carpool. Irv Homer, Susan Bray, Dominic Quinn, Frank Ford, Bernie Herman. They weren't on air because they shared a political perspective. They were on air because they all had personality. They could tell stories. You know, Homer was this acerbic libertarian before the rest of us knew what that meant or had heard of Ron or Rand Paul. I remember Susan Bray. She had this sultry voice and she was from down under. She billed herself as the saucy Aussie. Frank Ford was an unabashed liberal married to the Democratic Philadelphia district attorney, the so-called tough cookie Lynn Abraham. Dominic Quinn was a conservative, but he was perhaps best known for his tremendous command of the English language. And Bernie Herman, his moniker, what today we would call his brand, was that he was the gentleman of broadcasting. I often guest hosted for him. Let me tell you something. Today, you can get hired with that reputation. These hosts didn't share ideology. There were no mutual talking points. What they had in common was the ability to make the telephones ring. But AM radio was in trouble when I was getting started. FM was growing. AM needed a savior. And it got one. His name, Rush Limbaugh. And the first Gulf War was the backdrop against which things changed. Rush was hired on Sacramento's KFBK. This after the firing of Morton Downey Jr. You remember Downey gesticulating, cursing at guests, chain smoking on set. He was the one who stole the spotlight from the more sedate, the more cerebral likes of Phil Donahue or Oprah or Sally Jessy Raphael. Downey was canned on radio after he told an ethnic joke on air. Enter Rush Limbaugh. Rush was the former promotions director for the Kansas City Royals. He quickly became the top talk show host in Sacramento. Then he was placed into national syndication in 1988. And Limbaugh's impact on talk radio was transformative. Pre-internet, before Fox News, long before satellite radio, conservatives, I argue, rightfully felt shut out of the mainstream media. News junkies had NBC, ABC, CBS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, which all leaned left. Limbaugh is a gifted showman who filled that void by establishing a clubhouse for conservatives. And soon, every major market would have Limbaugh and a stable of his imitators. Philadelphia, my market, the last major market in the country to take Rush's show. And that's because my station owner, Chuck Schwartz, believed that a local radio station should have locally based hosts. But he knew that if he didn't take Limbaugh, a competitor would build a radio station around him. And so Rush joined the WWDB lineup. And when Fox News launched on television in 1996, it adopted the AM talk radio playbook. Later, MSNBC took note of that success, briefly gained viewers by giving Keith Olbermann a Downey-like platform for his diatribes against President George W. Bush. Anybody remember his claim that Bush was, quote, urinating on the Constitution? And now the business model for much of the media was toned down as a version of that which Morton Downey had established. Entertainment masked as news, constant conflict, good guys versus bad guys, and preordained outcomes, just like what? Pro wrestling. Good for ratings, good for revenue, bad for the country. This media paradigm has fathered and taken a toll on the way in which we're governed. There's been a huge uptick in incivility and polarization among our leaders in the exact same time period in which the media has moved to extremes. That's largely because of the power that Morton Downey's successors exert over primary voters. This rise in polarization in Washington, it correlates with the broadcast changes that I'm describing. Only, I don't just see correlation. I see causation too. Consider this. For most of the time that I've been a broadcaster, the National Journal has tracked the ideological leanings of Congress. And according to the Journal, pre-Limbaugh, on Ronald Reagan's watch, 60% of the House and Senate was comprised of moderates. In 1982, 58 senators and 344 House members had voting records that put them between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. In other words, there were so many Republican Senate moderates on Ronald Reagan's watch that they had their own weekly gathering. They called themselves the Wednesday Lunch Club. The members included Alan Simpson and Ted Stevens and Nassi Katzenbaum, John Hines, Arlen Specter, Bob Packwood, Bob Dole. Today, there would be no members showing up for lunch. By 2010, every Senate Republican was more conservative than every Senate Democrat, and every Senate Democrat was more liberal than every Senate Republican. And the House is similarly divided. Here's another barometer of change in the last 30 years. According to the Congressional Quarterly, as late as the 1970s, the typical member of one party voted with his or her party colleagues just over 60% of the time. In fact, my favorite example is a Texas congressman by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush. Papa Bush was in Congress, and he overlapped the administrations of Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Well, guess what? Congressman Bush voted with the Democratic Johnson administration about as often as he voted with the Republican Nixon administration. And that was typical then. But by 2010, the typical member of Congress voting with party members 90% of the time. Look, I'm not blaming polarization on just the media. Other factors have driven the divide. They include a lack of campaign finance reform. That causes nonstop fundraising. They don't have any time to socialize with one another. Hyperpartisan districts are an issue. The spread of politically homogeneous communities are a problem. We're self-sorting. Closed primaries are an issue. I'll tell you what else is an issue. Social media. The beer muscles that come from the anonymity online, that has fueled incivility and polarization. But mostly I see a causal connection between the media influence and polarization. Gridlock is what you get when Washington takes its cues from those with microphones and not the vast majority of the people. When politicians take their cues from the pro wrestling of the modern era, the nation suffers. Our climate won't improve until we do something about that. And in order for that to happen, more people need to change the channel. That, more than anything else, is what I wish I knew before I started talking.